Welcome, everybody. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. And this is another in our frequent series of Wednesday GLC at Lunch talks. Today is by one of our fellows, our visiting fellows, Chris Halsted. Chris is currently in Washington, D.C., where he lives and teaches. He is coming here in the month of May, but we moved up his talk to this time in the semester so that we'd have a proper audience, and we certainly do. We have a great audience out there online. Thank you all for coming. I must say that it is especially good to have a medievalist as one of our fellows. I think it has happened before, but fairly rarely. We've had fellows from all over the world studying all sorts of subjects about the slave trades, slavery itself, abolition, but rarely a medievalist and an early medievalist. Chris's centuries tend to be, I think, about the 8th through the 10th or 11th centuries. He did his PhD and master's degree at the University of Virginia in medieval history. He was an undergraduate at Oberlin College. And indeed, he has written many articles, I must say, a wealth of articles in all sorts of journals. And he's got 2 books in progress. One, I think, is perhaps already in with Cambridge University Press. It's called The Silver Age: Globality, Society, and the Slave Trade Among the Baltic Slavs. Now, part of what we're going to hear about today is the Slavic slave trade and this early medieval and medieval age, and the development of that very Slavic identity through part of this process of slave taking and slave trading. There are also links to this to the age of the Vikings. I don't know what those links are just exactly, but perhaps Chris will be telling us. So this is a fascinating topic. And anyone who's ever read David Bryan Davis and other scholars of early slave systems knows that the modern Western English term slave even comes from Slav, as it was used in Slavic countries, regions, and Slavic languages. So without further ado, Chris Halsted, I'm going to turn it over to you, and a hearty welcome. We look forward to hosting you in the month of May, but especially right now for your talk. Chris, it's all yours, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. That's a very amazingly kind introduction. Just for the sake of honesty, the book is not in with Cambridge University.
Oh,
they have
okay.
they've expressed interest, which I think is the polite way you're supposed to say it. But
Okay.
yeah, just so nobody thinks
there. I'll see what I can do about that. Great.
Oh, thanks everyone so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just as a quick warning, my wife is out of town, so I am on puppy duty. So if anyone hears any yowls or howls from the other room, it is because there are 2 pug puppies who do not like having their freedom constrained. So apologies for that. Let us get going. Can everyone hear me? I'm coming through okay? I assume someone would tell me if I wasn't.
Yes, you are. You're good.
Excellent. Great. You always got to check with Zoom. So this will probably be a bit of a different lunch talk from what I think you're probably used to. As David said, I was originally supposed to come to the center in January, but had to change my plans. Now I'm coming in May. So this is not a summary of research done per se, but more a prospectus for research to be done once I am in New Haven later in the spring. So for today, I am just going to give a brief description of the problem I'm tackling, the issues around Slavic ethnogenesis and the spread of ethnic ideas of Slavdom. I'll lay out my hypothesis as I see it, and then describe the research to be done in May. So let me just share my screen really quickly. So, my project focuses on the ethnic landscape of what is now Russia in the early Middle Ages, and specifically on the identity of the Slavs. The question I am looking at is the so-called Slavicization, which is a word that I guarantee I will stumble over at some point during this talk, of Russia. That is, the spread of Slavic ethnic identity across the majority of European Russia. This problem is not very well understood, but the process seems to have occurred contemporaneously with the establishment of Kievan Rus. This is the forerunner state of both modern Ukraine and Russia, and the Viking connection comes in here, traditionally understood by scholars to be a foundation of Scandinavian Vikings. So that's where we get the Vikings creating Russia. My working theory, and this is a very working theory, so any and all nuances are appreciated. My working theory connects this process of ethnic uptake, the spread of Slavdom, to the Viking Islamic slave trade, which was the economic foundation of Kievan Rus itself. I seek to discover whether Arabic language ethnic terminology was an element of this process of ethnic spread. Arabic language ethnic terminology collapsed the very diverse ethno-linguistic array of peoples who were the victims of this slave trade into a single category, Ṣaqāliba or Slavs. That is, did it matter for this process, for this Slavicization, that the peoples subject to Kievan Rus were also subject to a predatory relationship of enslavement and trafficking, and that the consumers of this trade, the customers of this trade in the Islamic world, identified all those enslaved as Ṣaqāliba. I will start with a brief summary of the state of the question of Slavic ethnogenesis as I understand it, focusing especially on the Slavs within Russia. From there, I'm going to introduce the topic of the Viking Age slave trade, and I see from the list of attendees that there's at least one person who is an expert in the Viking Age slave trade in here, so my apologies if we're going to do very broad summaries here, so just a warning. I will discuss my theory on the linkages between the two topics, and then I will end with a brief look at what I will investigate when I get to New Haven in May. So let us start with Slavic ethnogenesis. The Slavs appear on the landscape of European history in the 6th century AD, in the shadow of the Byzantine Empire during the time of Justinian. From there, the identity spreads very quickly, and today more than 1/3 of Europe by area is dominated by Slavic speakers. This seems to have become the case relatively rapidly in historical terms. So we think probably by the 11th or 12th century, most of the regions that speak Slavic today are already speaking Slavic. So it's a quick spread of this identity. There are a lot of problems in understanding this spread of identity. The first and most obvious one, which you may well have already noticed in the way I'm talking about this, is the problem of defining what exactly we mean when we say Slavic identity. When we say Slav, do we mean someone who is ethnically Slavic or someone who speaks a Slavic language? Does the latter necessarily imply the former? Once you bring in material culture, which medievalists are wont to do, can you identify a Slavic culture, quote unquote, with this or that piece of material evidence? So can you identify Slavs with Prague-style pottery, or with sunken featured buildings, or with a certain style of brooch? The very traditional way of doing this, which dates all the way back to pan-Slavic movements and the advent of national historiographies in the 19th century, is to identify Slavic ethnicity directly with Slavic languages and with various material markers understood to be Slavic. Along with this went an assumption that being a Slav was something that was intrinsic, that there was a genetic or descent component to Slavdom. The Slavs were thus understood to be a specific people who had come out of somewhere in Eurasia and spread to encompass much of Europe, in the same way that 19th century scholars understood the movement of Germanic peoples during the migration era. This is, of course, not the way we think about ethnicity anymore. Ethnicity in the modern understanding is a situational construct. A person or people or community could become Slavic when that ethnic identity presented them with a better option, better social positioning, better connections, whatever, than what they currently had. And this is, broadly speaking, what the most up-to-date theories on Slavic ethnogenesis suggest. The current most updated ideas, mostly put forward by a scholar named Florin Kurda, are that Slavic identity arises in the milieu of various interventions by Byzantine power within the Danube basin, and then spreads as a sort of privileged minority within the Avar Khaganate, which at this point controls much of the region of the Balkans until the beginning of the 9th century. And this is a massive oversimplification, so please do forgive me for my cliffs noting of this very complex problem. The issue from my perspective is that this model does not go very far to explaining the spread of Slavicness in what is now Russia. Most parts of Russia are quite distant from the Avar Empire during this time. When you look at the scholarship that specifically discusses the Russian aspect of this process, a lot of it tends to look a great deal like traditional accounts of ethnic expansion more generally. This expansion is largely understood as a colonization effort by the Slavs, which then supplants the people who are already there, people like the Finns, the Balts, other ethnic groups. So you get a lot of maps that look like this one on the screen right now, privileging the literal movement of Slavs, understood to come from somewhere and to have gone somewhere. And this is where we get to the political aspect of this whole thing. The time during this process occurred, the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, is the same time contemporaneous with the founding and flourishing of the polity of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus and its connection to modern politics, in fact, came up very recently at the beginning of the current kind of all-encompassing war. The summer before he invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin published an article arguing that the Ukrainians and the Russians were the same people, were one people, dating back to the foundation of Kievan Rus. And in Mr. Putin's telling, this meant that these peoples could be recombined, which, you know, he then proceeded to try to do. So this is still a very politically important history in Russia and Ukraine. This modern day political context, and perhaps more specifically the era of the 30s and 40s, when there was a lot of very nationalist archaeology happening, I think this can explain why the focus has been on explicit Slavic expansion, Slavic colonialism during this period. As many of you probably know, the Germans at this point in the 1930s and 40s were quite proudly claiming that their German ancestors had taken sword and plow and conquered Europe. And so Russian ideologues wanted the early Slavs to have been doing the same thing. It is probably down to the lack of attention paid to this field by many scholars, that the image has not really changed very much in this area. So this is my guiding question for this project. How do we get to a Slavic Russia? And secondarily, how does this interact with the establishment of Kievan Rus? It is my working hypothesis that this has everything to do with the Viking Islamic slave trade. In the last few centuries of the first millennium, a new network of trade arose connecting much of Western Eurasia, from the urbanized world of the Abbasid Caliphate and its various successor states, through the Eurasian steppe to the Baltic Sea and Northwestern Europe. Our foremost evidence for this connection is that over the course of more than 2 centuries, silver dirhams, tiny coins weighing roughly 3 grams, were exported in their tens of millions to the Baltic and Northern Europe. They are found today in hoards and depositions across the region. In exchange, the Islamic world received a number of different goods. The primary sources mention everything from wax to sturgeon gelatin to castor oil. But we think that the primary items of exchange were furs from the northern world and enslaved captives. This phenomenon, this trade route, has been referred to as a silver road or a fur route. It has been thought of as the northern branch of the more famous Silk Roads, but it could just as easily be called one of the earliest intercontinental slave trades. This route, which is often referred to as the Northern Arc trade route, which is the term brought into use by historian Michael McCormick, the slave trade along the Northern Arc has been something that medievalists as a whole have been grappling with a lot more over the last few decades. We've known about the phenomenon for more than a century, but especially since the 80s, 90s, there's been a lot more focus on it, especially as interdisciplinarity becomes more the rule in among medievalists. There's a lot of people interested now in the Vikings. A lot more people are really looking at the numismatics, at the coins. So there's really a flourishing now in attention to this complex history. And it does, I think, deserve the amount of attention on it. This is a history which spans 4 centuries. There's written sources from the Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, Old Norse, and Old English traditions. You need to have a lot of expertise coming together to grapple with this. What these studies have yet to engage with satisfactorily, to my mind at least, is the results of this slave trade. We've gone a long way to diagramming the rise and fall of this phenomenon over hundreds of years, but what effect did that have on the societies that it touched? Beyond merely describing the reality of the Northern Arc slave trade, that is, what did this mass trafficking of human beings from the Northern world south do? Both to the societies participating in the slave trade and those who were victims of it, which I should mention could very well be the same societies. How can we understand this as a contributing factor to Eurasian or European history? Let's start with the evidence for this phenomenon. The foremost, as I've already mentioned, is coinage. We have over 400,000 silver dirhams from the Islamic world that have been discovered in hoards and deposits across Russia and Northern Europe from the 9th and 10th centuries. Just a massive number of coins. Dirhams are a really good source for studying networks of exchange. They are usually minted not only with the name of the ruler who minted them stamped on them, but also the name of the mint and even the year that they were minted. So in aggregate, 400,000 dirhams provide a huge data set telling us when and from where silver was being exported into the Northern world. We can trace differences in who's minting silver, how much silver is being exported, where it's being exported to, even differences in the purity of the silver. All of this is very valuable stuff for understanding the mechanics of this trade. So, what does all this silver have to do with slavery? To map the corridors of the slave trade in this time, we basically just reverse the direction of the silver flow. So if we see a lot of silver being minted in Samanid Central Asia in the 10th century, transported through Volga, Bulgaria, and then ending up in depositions in northern Russia, we can deduce that enslaved captives are traveling the opposite direction. You may very well and very reasonably wonder how we can be so sure. Certainly many things were traded for silver. And this is absolutely true. What we see, however, is an incredible association of silver with enslaved captives in our written sources. And in particular, enslaved captives from a particular ethnic group, the Ṣaqāliba, commonly identified with Slavs, though it's a bit more complex than that. I'd like to quickly go through a few of these written sources to kind of sketch out the parameters of this trade. The most to the point account is probably that of Ibn Rusta, a geographer from the city of Isfahan, writing in the early 10th century. In his account of the Rus, a people most often identified as Scandinavian, this is where we get the name Kievan Rus in Russia. Ibn Rushd describes Rus society as such, quote, "They wage war on the Ṣaqāliba, traveling in ships until they reach them. They take the Ṣaqāliba captive, transport them to Khazran, Khazaria, and Bulkar, Volga, Bulgaria, and sell them there. There is not a farmer among them, and they subsist on what they take away from the land of the Ṣaqāliba." A little while later, he describes that, quote, "The money which they acquire from the sale of these," by which at this point he means not only enslaved captives, but also furs, "they fasten onto their belts. That is, they use it as ornamentation." When talking about the Bulgars, Ibn Rushd notes that they deal in whole white dirhams, dirhams with a very high silver content. And this is something that we find archaeologically as well. The dirhams that tend to be used in the northern world are purer than those circulating in the Islamic world. Seemingly, this means that the dirhams used in the northern world are valued for their silver content, where in the Islamic world, they're more valued for their, I guess you could say, fiat value. The later Gardisi, who shows a lot of similarities with Ibn Rushd's information and probably relied on the same source, notes that both Rus and Ṣaqāliba would only sell their goods for dirhams. They would not take any other currency, and they would not barter. Another very valuable account is given by Ibn Fadlan, a Baghdadi emissary who describes a Rus market on the Volga in the 920s. He describes the Rus traveling to sell specifically female slaves, jariya, and Rus women, he says, wore silver neck rings to commemorate their husbands' commercial successes, one neck ring for every 10,000 dirhams collected. So this is a form of ornamentation based on silver, displaying economic status and success in the slave trade. And Ibn Fadlan's version of this slave trade is very gendered. He has a lot to say about sexual slavery in particular. And because of this and many other reasons, historians are often kind of conflicted about how seriously to take some of the details he gives, since he seems to have a decent amount of hangups that come through in his writing. But his description of this region as one dominated by the slave trade is one that defines writing about this region for the rest of the 10th century. Geographers like al-Masudi, Ibn Hawqal, and al-Muqaddasi all refer to slaves as a primary import from the northern world. Similarly, the Arabic and Persian written sources basically uniformly describe the Eurasian steppe as a pretty violent place defined by raiding between various peoples, specifically for the purpose of slaving. According to these accounts, basically everyone on the steppe was active in this slave trade, though they do give primacy to the Scandinavians, to the Rus. A vital account of this trade is actually given by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogennetus, writing in the 950s. He describes a journey down the Dnieper River, where the slavers, the Rus, regularly have to disembark and portage around the areas of rapids in this river. Of interest to us, he also describes them marching their enslaved captives through these barriers. So, quote, "At this barrier, all of them alight on the land frontwards, and the men who have been divided from them to keep watch exit, and they proceed, and these men keep sleepless watch for the Pechenegs, a Turkic people in what is now Ukraine. The rest take up the goods, which they keep on the monoxyla, on a type of ship they use to traverse these rivers, and they lead the slaves in their chains 6 miles over dry land until they have gone through the barrier. Then, some dragging their monoxyla, some carrying them on their shoulders, they lead them to the other side of the barrier, and throwing the monoxyla in the river and loading their baggage, they embark and sail away again." This is one of 7 rapids that the Rus encounter on this journey. This was a very challenging trip to make, so the profits that it produced must have been quite vast to motivate such an undertaking. A final category of evidence, which has probably been one of the most controversial, is archaeological evidence. The problem here is that enslavement is a obviously a social or legal status. There is no uncontroversial material marker of enslavement. Still, archaeologists have identified a number of ways we might get past this problem. Finds of keys, locks, and manacles are often considered pretty good evidence for the slave trade. These would have been used to restrain captives while transporting them or at market. The common problem that scholars see is that these could also have been used for judicial purposes, that is, to restrain criminals, or to restrain captives taken in war and intended for ransom, which is a practice that existed alongside enslavement and slave trafficking throughout this entire period. Scandinavian archaeologists have come to other solutions, looking at essentially variable levels of wealth and prestige and things like burials and housing plans to figure out the social landscape in Scandinavia. Many people have taken the best evidence of the slave trade as silver dirhams themselves, since they are so uncontroversially linked to the slave trade in the written sources. One solution that archaeologists have come to, and this has been pioneered in this context specifically by Marek Jankowiak, is to look at the whole landscape of a slaving society as a unit, to posit how enslavement and trafficking might have worked as part of an entire society. In Poland, where Jankowiak has done much of his work, he, for example, has identified massive fortifications in the southern part of the country. These are he identified as potentially intended for holding captives being trafficked to the south. These are much larger than any comparable fortresses in the region. They are mostly without evidence of any kind of buildings or other structures inside the fortresses, so they're big, empty fortresses. And the numismatic evidence indicates that there was some direct trade between southern Poland and the Black Sea region going overland at this time. So this, if you look at the whole model together, this looks like it makes sense as evidence for the practice of slaving. The idea is thus that you have to look at everything holistically. In general, you are not going to find incontrovertible, direct archaeological evidence of the slave trade, at least in this era. But that does not mean that slavery is an invisible commodity, quote unquote. Some have phrased it this way, but rather slave trafficking is a social and economic practice that has an ordering effect on its entire society and should be understood and investigated in that manner. And I take Jankowiak's methodology as a core philosophy of my own investigation of this subject. So how does this all relate to the spread of Slavic identity in Russia? The crux of the issue is this. Arabic sources, where they describe the northern slave trade, fixate nearly exclusively on a single ethnic binary. On the one hand, they describe the Rus, a people modern historians identify with Scandinavians and especially with Swedes, as the traffickers in the system, the ones controlling the trade. On the other hand, there are the Ṣaqāliba. This word comes from the Greek sklavenos, which is cognate with the word Slav. In English, as David mentioned at the top of the lunch, this of course gives us the word slave and its derivatives. Arabic sources uniformly describe the captives being trafficked by the Rus as Ṣaqāliba, as Slavs. Now, Islamic slavery was a very different phenomenon from many other historical forms of slavery. I'm sure many of you know a lot about this, but I'm happy to go into it more if anyone is interested. For our purposes, it's important to realize that Islamic slavery, despite its differences from other forms of slavery, did have a racial, or at the very least, an ethnic component. Arabic sources from the Middle Ages describe the various qualities and flaws of each ethnic group, or perceived ethnic group, as enslaved servants. So a commentator from the 11th century, the Christian physician Ibn Butlan, notes that enslaved Greeks made good shopkeepers, just as an example. This ethnic essentialism, ethnic specificity, makes it very noticeable when Ṣaqāliba start to show up in the Arabic world, in the Islamic world, because they take notice of and care about the ethnicity of the enslaved people in their society. The influx of enslaved Ṣaqāliba is distinctly noticeable in the historic record and coincides with the advent of the Northern Arc slave trade. Though there's also other routes going through Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, for instance. Caliphs and sultans will have entire regiments of enslaved Ṣaqāliba bodyguards. In Al-Andalus, enslaved Ṣaqāliba soldiers become a recognized ethnic faction within the court by the end of the 10th century. And sometimes they break out into conflict with enslaved soldiers of other backgrounds, like the Berbers. So there's ethnic violence between various factions of enslaved soldiers in Islamic Spain. The 9th century polymath, Al-Jahiz, describes a number of encounters with enslaved Ṣaqāliba in Baghdad, though these are framed within an argument in favor of making eunuchs. Jahiz seems to think that Ṣaqāliba were intrinsically stupid, but that their intelligence could be improved by castration. So that's an interesting frame for his describing his encounters with Ṣaqāliba. The use of the word in relationship to slavery was so widespread that it led to a semantic shift over the centuries. By the 11th century, in Al-Andalus, the word Ṣaqlab, the singular of Ṣaqāliba, could just mean eunuch. Further east in the lands of Syria and Baghdad, Ṣaqlab could just refer to a red-haired man. All of this is to give background for one very important detail. Arabic ethnographers were not great at sussing out the fine details of various ethnic groups, especially when those groups lived a great distance from the heartland of the urbanized medieval Islamic world. There is no word attested in the Arabic sources from this time for peoples like the Balts and the Finns. And these are peoples who we can be pretty confident from other written sources, from material evidence, and from the long-term patterns of exploitation in the region, we can be pretty confident that Balts and Finns were being trafficked south to be sold as slaves. So the word Ṣaqāliba, although it comes from the ethnic term for Slavs, comes to signify essentially any one of these fair-skinned northerners who were trafficked south. The Arabic sources usually actually describe them as being ahmar, ruddy or reddish in coloring. So that's a specific kind of description within the Arabic thought world of racial categories in the Middle Ages. There is some misinformation about this out there. A lot of places, especially online, will oversimplify and claim that Ṣaqāliba came to mean just white slave, which of course feeds into the white slavery mythology that you find in a lot of far-right discourses. This, I should mention, is absolutely not the case, primarily because Arabic racial terminology did not have a category of white as we think of it, but also because Arabic sources recognized and distinguished Ṣaqāliba from other white, quotes intended, peoples. So they had categories for the Germans, Namjin, or the Franks, Ifranj, or of course the Scandinavian Rus. And these are all understood as different peoples from the Ṣaqāliba. Within the Ṣaqāliba, however, there was a degree of ethnic collapsing in this terminology, especially when it came to the other peoples of the far north, like Balts and Finns. Now, curiously, the same people erased by this Arabic ethnic terminology, the Balts and the Finns, these are the same ones whose lands undergo a process of Slavicization sometime around this period. As Kievan Rus is founded by Scandinavian adventurers and transforms from a predatory network of Scandinavian slaver lords to something more resembling a territorial kingdom, these are the peoples who will disappear from what becomes the core territories of Russia. Famously, the land around Moscow was originally inhabited, for example, by the Finnic Maria people. Now it's Slavic, right? So my guiding preliminary hypothesis for this project is whether this ethnic binary, the division between Rus as enslaver and Ṣaqāliba as enslaved was utilized and internalized by the Rus themselves. And when this kingdom became a territorial one, did that translate to an understanding that all or many subjects of the Rus regime were thus Ṣaqāliba? This is a hard question to look at for a lot of reasons. Chief among them, the utter lack of written sources from Kievan Rus itself in this period. The earliest written account of Kievan history is the Russian Primary Chronicle, or Chronicle of Bygone Years, which survives to us in a version compiled at the beginning of the 12th century, though it did likely include older generations of sources. This text does have a description of the creation of Kievan Rus, but it tells it in a highly stylized and romanticized way. In the telling of this document, the Slavic peoples of this land, which the document compares to both the peoples scattered to the winds after the Tower of Babel falls and the tribes of Israel, these Slavic peoples invite the Scandinavian Rurikid dynasty in to rule over them, thus forming the dynasty that rules Kievan Rus and then Russia for 500 years. Historians largely agree that that is absolutely not what happened. So while close engagement with the Russian Primary Chronicle will definitely be key for my research going forward, I'm also trying to broaden my source base. I want to look widely at texts that touch on this region from a variety of different linguistic traditions to get a wider picture of this phenomenon in this time. There are a few classic texts, mostly, as I've discussed, from Arabic, some from Persian and Greek, some from a very few from Old Church Slavonic, that always come into the conversation when one talks about Slavic ethnicity and its spread within Russia. I'm trying to see if I can get wider in seeing anything that can touch on this problem. And this might very well be a fool's errand. There is every chance that the reason that there is a circumscribed source base for this subject is that that's what exists. But I will not know until I look, so I might as well look. So my goal for my time at the center when I come in May is thus to read widely. I think it's probably prudent for my first few days to be spent talking to librarians. I have been wrangling the online finding aids, but so far they have frequently bested me. This project does relate to my first monograph, which is in progress, but I am at the beginning of this particular line of research, so the goal will be to gather information and find sources that can help guide and define where I'm going in future. In terms of manuscripts, there are a few collections that I'm very interested in looking at. The library's wide Arabic language holdings will be of primary interest. There are a number of pre-modern Arabic manuscripts that I think could be useful: geographies, travelogues, histories, also things like poetry and literature, which may have relevant passages. There's also the Greek collection and the Old Church Slavonic collection. The Old Church Slavonic collection essentially is a place where I freely admit I have been stymied by the online finding aids. So being in person and actually seeing things, I think, will be very important there. And finally, it's also going to be really important to the historiography of the project to have access to a truly world-class library. Much of the debates about things like Slavic linguistics and archaeology and numismatics, these debates take place in obscure and low print run specialist journals, and there are very few places in this hemisphere that have them. So it's basically come to New Haven or start looking at flights to Berlin. My month at the center will allow me some real time to grapple with these questions, with the scholarship, with what sources are available that actually touch on this subject, and with where I can take this project in future. And any suggestions guiding points of interest from anyone in the audience are more than welcome at this point in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Wow. This is absolutely fascinating. And the world does not know enough about the Slavic, shall we say, Arabic, Slavic slave trade. It is very old. It lasted a long time. That's actually my first. Well, first of all, by the way, there are tremendous Slavic collections here. I don't know them, but there truly are. I don't know if you've been in contact yet with any particular librarian, but I can help with that. I mean, the Beinecke Library has a Slavic expert, so does Sterling, I think. There's also tremendous Arabic collections here. Anyway, that is kind of my first question here is about this scale and the kind of infrastructure that this trade must have developed. You mentioned the hill fort. I think you called them hill forts all over that map. Could you tell us a little more about those, or what's known about them? I'm sure what's known about them comes in part through archaeology, but I mean, in of course the Atlantic slave trade, the Indian Ocean slave trade, and the domestic U.S. slave trade, there were whole systems of these forts of all kinds, entrepôts and so on. Since this was primarily all a land trade, although they still had to traverse the Black Sea, I suppose. But since this was mostly a land trade, there must have been quite an infrastructure to make this system function. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the sheer scale of it?
Yeah, of course. So first off, although there is a big land element in it, a lot of the trade is actually riverine. So
Sure.
the Rus element of the trade, especially the big innovation that the Rus bring to it, is they figure out how to sail essentially all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea by cutting across between various rivers in European Russia, which is a huge kind of navigational accomplishment. The infrastructure of the trade differs pretty drastically depending on what area you're talking about around it. So further east, as you near kind of the Central Asian element, a lot of this is being done via camel caravan, which we actually have very good written sources on that, especially this guy Ibn Fadlan, because he joins one of these caravans and describes the process of trudging through the steppe land and visiting various places and being guests of them, and finally reaching the city of Bulgar in Volga, Bulgaria, where he sees all this trading taking place. Elsewhere, this trade, as far as I see it, motivates the construction of a pretty widespread network of centers. Within the Baltic, I think the slave trade underpins the first wave of Baltic urbanism, which is in the 8th century onwards. You get the beginnings of these seasonal marketplaces. Those develop slowly into something more like a city. The archaeological word is proto-urban, which I always find to be an interesting kind of dodge of the question of whether or not they're cities. So those in various forms spread all across the Baltic. Inland, you get places like these hill forts that are debated about pretty hotly their function. Many of them seem to be forts for local rulers, local communities to defend themselves. Some of them seem like they might have been used in slave trafficking. It's really hard to tell. And this is, the archaeologists are actively, even now somewhere in Europe, there are two archaeologists debating about this somewhere, I'm absolutely sure. The last thing I'll say on infrastructure is just the scale, you're right, is incredibly wide, right? We have we have accounts of the Rus themselves getting as far south as Baghdad, and I'm sure they show up other places and just nobody bothered to write it down. We have, the silver being traded here is mined in the mountains of Pakistan, minted in Central Asia, and shows up in hordes in Iceland. So there's just the scale of it is absolutely massive. Part of this is down to the Rus themselves, but part of it is down to their ability to strike deals with local peoples and local powers. So within European Russia, the trick that they do at first is it's a very challenging thing to take a bunch of ships out of a river, pick them up, and move them into another river. That's a huge ordeal. So what actually springs up is this economy of local groups in these around these portage areas who will live near them and help the Rus portage their ships when they come through, and get some kind of payment, some kind of tribute from the Rus as they do. But this is an entire network based upon the existence of these long distance trade routes, changes the settlement pattern of the peoples living there. And then later, when the Rus settle down as Kagans, as rulers, as kings, as whatever they are, when Kievan Rus comes about, these are the peoples who become their subjects. So there's this weird transition from slaver network into like European style Christian kingdom that is also not really that well understood. It's a very piecemeal kind of thing. And once a lot of the written sources come online, they act like the Rus have always been these kings, when it looks quite as if like a generation before they were warlords essentially, which begs the question what the difference between a king and a warlord is, and that's a fair question. But you're anyway, very incredible system, very widespread infrastructure.
Wow. And there must have been in effect slave raiding, or
oh yeah,
some degree of this king or ruler raiding another. It's the same as it was done in Africa, I suppose.
Yeah, it's widespread raiding. There's especially around this also gets into archaeological debates, but especially around the foundation of Poland, there's a massive like chunk of the country that is based, so far as we can tell, all the fortresses in that part of the country burned down over a 30-year period between like 920 and 950. And we think what that is the foundation of the earliest Polish state. People from somewhere else in Poland, from Gniezno in Greater Poland, are coming there, taking everything, probably taking the people, selling them into captivity, and using those funds to set up the first Polish kingdom.
Wow. Whoa. So states were born out of this, in effect, because that happened in Africa too. I mean,
yeah.
Famously. Wow. So what do we know about, and I'm getting a series of questions here, I want to get to them, but what do we know about the demand side of this? I mean, is that part of, I mean, that's not your study per se, but the demand for this all over the Arabic world must have been tremendous to go to this extent.
Yes.
To find disposable people.
So there's a couple of things here. The first is that within Islamic law, you are not allowed to enslave people that live in Islamic territory. So if there's an Islamic ruler, you can't enslave those people. This means, and this is like the classic kind of slaving zone, non-slaving zone people that has been looked at in a lot of different ways. But it's like it's very explicit in the Islamic world. You cannot legally do that. So this leads to slave traders, slave traffickers going elsewhere, going outside of the now very large Islamic world to try to find captives. Because of the kind of uniquenesses of Islamic slavery, the demand for slaves is mostly an urban and upper class phenomenon. So these are all the people being trafficked along these routes are going to be kind of high class prestige slaves. So you get slave soldiers.
Plantation agriculture or
no, there's no within the Arabic. Largely speaking, within the Islamic world, agricultural slavery is tried like once in Iraq in the 9th century, and it leads to a 30-year-long rebellion that messes everything up for a whole lot of the time, and they don't try it again. So this is what I mean when I say it's a very different system of slavery than ones that other periods look like. So yeah, the demand for these captives is going to be primarily slave soldiers, eunuchs, and concubines. That's going to be the overall spread of what people are looking for. And it does seem to have been an incredibly lucrative trade, because otherwise they wouldn't have done it, right? It takes so much effort to do this. It must have been very high demand. Pardon me.
Monica Green wants to know about how you all study these hoards of silver coins. How do you use them? How do you, she mentions, is there an Oxford collection of this? She names this, I don't know. How do you use the coins? What kind of source are they? Are they a source showing routes and directions and origins of the traders, or both ways. It's a fascinating source when you think of it.
Yeah, it's a really incredible source. The way that the coins are largely studied is, and then there's a fantastic Oxford project, Dirhams for Slaves, which Marek Jankowiak, who I mentioned, was involved with. It ran for, I think, 5 years in the mid 2010s, and a lot of very good information came out of that. Really amazing kind of revolutionary analysis of the entire system. The key thing about dirhams is, because they've got the year on them and usually the place of minting, you can trace pretty direct routes. You can say this dirham arose from this place and was deposited in this place. And so we know that there's some connection between the city of Samarkand in Central Asia and, this town in Norway. When you look at the corpus as this gets into numismatics, which is not actually my specialty. I read a lot of numismatists, but I am not one. When you look at the hoard as corpus, the way that a hoard is composed can also be really important. So if you have a hoard buried in the ground that is 400 coins, and they're all from like about the same couple of years, that looks like a lot of very intense trading that is taking place over a very short period of time and then buried very quickly. By comparison, some hoards have a wider time horizon. So if you get a hoard where the most recent dirham buried is a dirham from the 870s, but it also has coins from all the way back in 800, 810, 820, then you can say, okay, so these coins are circulating a lot. These are entering circulation and entering the economy within the Baltic and not just being grabbed up and placed down. Then when you scale up to look at the entire corpus of dirhams found over broad regions, and this is something that numismatists like Thomas Noonan, Roman Kovalev, and Marek Jankowiak are way better at. When you look at it on that scale, you can start to look at broader patterns. So, for example, there's a pretty large influx of coins in the 9th century that collapses in the 870s, starts up again in the year 900 or around the year 900, collapses in the 960s, 970s, 980s. So you get patterns of where things are going and how the routes and patterns of this change over time because of this incredible source base.
Follow the silver coins, or follow the money, as the story goes. You're getting questions here. I don't know if you can see them, Chris.
I will pick them up over here.
There's one from Christopher Case. It's all about ethnogenesis, and it gets quite into the details of this. But he's also asking about Jewish slaving merchants. And there's a lot of mentioning here of other scholars. I don't know if you want to take that one or not. For the good medievalist in our audience here, not sure. And then I'll just ask another one or two here. Is there any, from Charles Scheinberg, is there any information about the nature of the treatment of those enslaved as Ṣaqāliba, and when does it appear to end?
Excellent questions. Let me take the question on Pritzak, Kurta, and Nichols first of all. So Pritzak is this is getting into kind of specialist scholarship stuff. Pritzak is
we want to keep our specialists happy out there.
Yeah, exactly. Pritzak is, I think, a singularly brilliant but also very weird analysis of this entire system. There's some theories, some rabbit holes that Pritzak goes down that I don't think quite work. In particular, he, if memory serves, he connects the Rus to a single. He makes the Rus a single, essentially merchant corporation run out of. I believe he does settle on a single West European town that somehow this corporation is being run out of. It's a very interesting analysis. He does a lot of other interesting things with various sources. Pritzak, I need to engage more with Pritzak, but I think that there's a lot of places he goes that are not always don't always work that well. in terms of the role of Jewish merchants, there are sources for the Jewish slave trade during this time. In particular, a group known as the Ravinia.
Mhm. Mhm.
They're not nearly as widespread as the sources on the Rus, and they also appear to go through different routes. Basically, there's this 9th century Baghdad text which describes the routes of the Ravinia on one point and the routes of the Rus on the other point. The Rus seem to go north, the Ravinia go through the Mediterranean, or at least seem to. But it's also and this is something Pritzak has worked on, it's also a very fragmentary and hard to read text. It's like a really challenging source. And this is the only place we get the word Ravinia referring to this group of hypothetically slave trading Jewish merchants. We don't have it other than this one text. So all that said, I am not a specialist in the Mediterranean slave trade, and I'm sure there's a lot of I'm sure there's a lot of people who have done work on the Ravinia that I'm not familiar with, so I can't really comment on it. But the Rus side of the trade is far better attested than the Ravinia side of the trade, essentially.
Great.
At least within, sorry, I was just going to say, at least within the Arabic corpus. I'm not familiar with all the
Okay, great. Patricia Daly. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I cut you off from the second question. Go ahead.
No, second question. Information about the nature of the treatment of those enslaved as Ṣaqāliba. It's really hard to get at the experience of enslaved people during this period. All of the written sources are coming from prestige, upper class state positions. You don't really get something like where you get something that can be closer to the diary of an enslaved person or something like that. There's a couple of saints' lives from the Baltic Sea that talk about what a like an Irish Christian might experience being taken captive by the Vikings. That might have some commonalities, but it's coming from a very different lens. So we don't really have very good information about treatment. I will say that, as I said, most of the people who are enslaved in this system are meant for domestic roles as domestic slaves. So a lot of these are in the Islamic system. A lot of these are actually going to be relatively high class people within their society. It's actually within a medieval Islamic society, being a concubine to a powerful man is a relatively prestigious position. That's not obviously none of that bodes well for things like consent and all those relevant elements, but it's not like agricultural slavery, for example, not really a thing. They're not being used in silver mines like the Romans did, right? So there's ways in which the treatment is a lot more merciful than various other forms of slave taking, though of course you don't want to compare. When does this appear to end? The wide scale Rus run slave trade collapses at the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th. That said, there's every indication that kind of the normal quote unquote level of slave trading in these regions goes on up until the modern period. So people are being trafficked from Russia, from various places, south into the Islamic world up until the 18th century. Right, that just keeps happening. So this specific, very intense phenomenon collapses around the millennium, but smaller scale things keep going. And this is where we get the fact that slave comes into English, right? Because slave comes into English because in Western Europe, to be a Slav is to be an enslaved person, and that's not something that ends in the early Middle Ages. That continues.
So in effect, Chris, this trade, probably the longest lasting slave trade we know about. Longer than the Atlantic, maybe longer than the Indian Ocean. Although trading within
longer than
centuries old too.
Yeah, I would say it's got to be the trans-Saharan trade is probably the longest lasting.
Yeah, that's
but definitely longer than the Atlantic trade, although at a far smaller volume, right? Like we're not talking anything like the Atlantic slave trade in terms of volume here.
Yeah. Is there any numbers debate about this? I mean, is it very, very hard to do because, I mean, the numbers debate about the Atlantic trade was, of course, once a tremendous controversy. not so much anymore. But is there any numbers debate about the Slavic trade?
There is. It's very hard to get at specific numbers because like people aren't keeping records. There's no like 1,000 slaves were bought at this port at this time. Like it doesn't happen. The way that people have tended to do it is to calculate the number of dirhams that probably came into Northern Europe during this time, calculate the cost of an enslaved person, and then do multiplication. That relies on several assumptions. Like, so we have 400,000 dirhams that we found. Does that imply that 10 million dirhams came in? Does that imply that 20 million dirhams came in? You just have to make some assumptions there. And then you have to make assumptions about the value of an enslaved person that are also very challenging and probably change over time. So I don't really tend to get involved in the numbers debate. I tend to say significant and important, but
Right.
I'm not going to put a specific number on it because I feel like it's going out on a limb
Sure.
evidentiarily.
And numbers are politics too. You always got to be careful with them.
Yeah. No.
Daly is in effect asking a question about, I think, whether there was moral pushback, any kind of movement against this, that he might have found in literary or religious sources. I don't know. Was there an anti-slave trade phenomenon at all that anyone?
So the anti-slave trade, medieval pushback against the slave trade tends to more be nuancing of the slave trade. So for example, there's this Islamic law that you cannot enslave anyone who is in who lives under Islamic rule. You also can't enslave a Muslim. Now, you can enslave somebody who later converts to Islam, and conveniently, you don't have to manumit them if they convert to Islam. So that becomes a great loophole that they use throughout the Middle Ages. In Christian contexts, there's a lot of hand-wringing in this period about selling other Christians into slavery. That's considered to be poor taste. But we know that it still happens because there's like every generation, some bishop will write a text being like, hey, please stop selling each other into slavery. But again, it's more of a concern about Christian on Christian enslavement or Muslim on Muslim enslavement than it is about the practice of enslavement more generally, which seems, to my knowledge, I can't think of an exception, though I'm sure there is one. It seems to be enslavement seems to be generally understood as a common fact of life. And it's going to happen. You should treat your slaves well. People agree. Like, you shouldn't be mean. You shouldn't be cruel. But enslavement is considered something that is pretty universal.
Indeed, it was, and it certainly was within African societies too. It doesn't mean the individual slave didn't resist when being captured by any means, and nor during slave trade transportation. But it is always something we have to remind ourselves, isn't it? And I wonder how you do this with medieval history. I know in teaching now and then about the Atlantic slave trade, or for that matter, the domestic slave trade in America, and you face students who say, how could people do this to each other? Well, in their world, it was a world of hierarchies, terrible hierarchies, and sometimes a person was better off if they got connected somehow in the hierarchy that brought them safety, and so on, so on, so on. That was certainly true within African slave systems.
There will be, one of the questions mentions the Mamluks, which is, of course, an incredibly fascinating society well, can mean multiple things. First means slave soldiery in general within an Islamic and Arabic context, but then also can mean the specific Mamluk Sultanate within Egypt. And as the Mamluk sultans were enslaved soldiers who, to become sultans, would be manumitted and right before and made sultan. It was a dynasty of slave soldiers. So if you wanted to raise to be at the top of society in Mamluk Egypt, which lasted for 300 years, you had to start off as an enslaved soldier from outside Mamluk Egypt. There's at least one case where they forgot to manumit the sultan before he gets appointed sultan, and so they have a technically enslaved sultan. Islamic slavery is a lot more complicated and kind of weird than a lot of other systems of slavery is my point.
Full of ironies that the simplicity of the Enlightenment notion of free or slave just doesn't fit.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still getting more questions here. Let's see. Good Lord. There's a simple question here from Nashar Kadir about this business. If a Slavic person who's been enslaved converts to Islam, what does that do to the status of enslavement? Does it do anything? Or were they forced to convert in some cases?
So technically, you're not supposed to be forced to convert in any case. Conversion via coercion is not allowed within Islam. That doesn't count as a real conversion.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Sorry, it just started raining very aggressively outside my window. That said, I'm sure there were general. The entire system is coercive, right? So I'm sure the motivation to convert to Islam to better your station probably existed for many people. You would not get instantly freed when you converted to Islam. You were still perfectly allowed to be enslaved. But within the Islamic system, it was generally considered a good thing to eventually manumit your slaves. So that would eventually happen, at which point there'd be more of like a patron-client relationship between the former master and the enslaved person, very similar to the way that Roman slavery worked. I don't know this for a fact, but I am assuming that conversion to Islam probably expedited the process of manumission, as did other forms of acculturation, right? So I think there's another question somewhere about Slavic demographics and whether we can see the effect of Slavic people showing up in the Middle East. Well, they're all learning Arabic when they get there, right? There's no noticeable Slavic impact in terms of language in the regions of the Middle East, because when you get to the first thing you're expected to do is learn Arabic or Persian, depending on where you are, and that's how you kind of advance in society.
Sure. And it was considered to be over time a mode of assimilation.
Oh yeah.
Brutal, but assimilation nonetheless. I have one last question for you, and this is less about your scholarship. We're always looking for new ideas for big conferences. Is it common in your field, in your world, to hold conferences on the Slavic slave trade, the Slavic Arabic slave trade? Do you all have an annual association or anything like that? Or, I mean, if we were to think down the road, this is in the future, because we've done an entire conference once on the Indian Ocean slave trade. We've done all kinds of things on the Atlantic trade, and so on. But do you hold conferences occasionally on this story from every angle of this, the Islamic world, the Slavic world? Do you guys have an association? Is there an association of historians of the medieval Slavic slave trade?
There is, to my knowledge, not an association. There are conferences on the subject pretty regularly held. These are mostly not so much on an annual basis, but just there's kind of an ad hoc. There's a network of scholars, mostly in Europe, who work on this, and there's been a number of conferences on the subject. I haven't been to them because I'm in the States, and it is frankly it costs a lot of money to get to Europe. But there are conferences on the subject. There's edited volumes entirely dedicated to the subject. There's a recent very good volume on Ibn Fadlan himself, on this wonderful source that goes through all these things. So there's a lot of research being done on this topic, and I'm really only a very small slice of it. So
it's a hot field, so to speak.
It's a hot field.
Okay, that's interesting, and I may want to talk to you more later about that. It just occurs to me it could be a really cool conference on this that would draw Islamic scholars and Slavic scholars, Europeanist, Middle Eastern scholars together. And maybe we can talk about this when you're here in May.
Sounds excellent.
Well, let me again thank our audience. We had a great audience, and a lot of them are still here. Thank you all for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your day out there. And Chris, thank you so much for doing this, and look forward to seeing you in the month of May.
Look forward to it.
Okay, thanks so much.